Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is Alycia Pinizzotto. Oh, Alycia, I hope I didn't butcher your name. You told me it and I practiced it and now I forgot exactly how to pronounce it. But Alycia is the director, the executive director at Story International, which she'll explain what she does in this podcast. Long story short, we are going to talk about different approaches to orphan care. Now, I want to give a little maybe word of warning up front that there is a fairly heated debate about how best to care for orphans. And one side of the debate is very big on orphanages, and Alycia and her husband ran an orphanage for many years. But she more recently, like over the last 5 years, has had a really change in perspective. And so now she would be much more critical of orphanages as a means of caring for orphans. There's no debate, shouldn't be any debate about whether we should care for orphans. The debate is how best to care for orphans. And my word of warning up front is I know probably some of you have been personally invested in, maybe financially, maybe with your time in orphanages, and you're going to hear some things that are going to be challenging. I'll just be straight up. You're going to hear some things that are going to challenge whether that's the best way to care for orphans. I can imagine a decent percentage of you are going to be thrilled to hear somebody speak about this because you too have had maybe personal issues with orphanages. So this is going to be a sensitive episode. I love Alycia's perspective. She's very cautious and kind and humble and wise, and you'll hear she keeps qualifying herself and like, I don't want to be too critical or make people feel bad, but here's kind of where I'm at and why. So anyway, that's the word of warning up front. So please welcome to the show for the first time, Alycia Pinizzotto. All right, hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. I'm here with Alycia Pinizzotto. Alycia, thanks so much for joining me. Out of nowhere, as a mutual friend put us in touch, and I just love what you're doing through your ministry, according to what I read on the website. So I'm really excited about this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I am totally honored. This is not like a thing I do. I feel very honored to be here.
Awesome. Well, why don't you tell people what you have been doing and do as a ministry? And I would love to fairly quickly get into kind of different approaches to orphan care. And I know you've had a really change in perspective on that, and it's a fascinating journey. So but tell us who you are and how you got into the work that you're doing.
Yeah, my name's Alycia. Honestly, the best way to kind of sum up everything is like I was a 19-year-old accidental missionary who has been in orphan care ever since for about a decade now, and pretty much done everything wrong in the context of our ministry. Our ministry is called Story International, and we can get into that later. But fast forward to today, we are an organization implementing family-based care initiatives in Guatemala, which is like a big fancy word in the orphan care community, which just means that how we approach orphan care is the family at the center. We're looking at keeping families together and keeping kids out of orphanages and looking to alternative forms of care versus a traditional orphanage structure. So that's kind of the long and short of who we are today, at least.
Yeah. Would it be fair, not if I'm known for asking really stupid questions, but people say there's no stupid question or liars. There's lots of stupid questions, and I've asked many of them. But would it be fair to say that within orphan care ministry, there's two very general, but two kind of different perspectives? One approach would be very much pro orphanage, like orphanages are a healthy, helpful way to address the need of orphan care. And then another approach that would be very critical of orphanages. Is that a accurate way of framing it, or is that?
Yeah, it is. And I would say it's unfortunate that that's accurate because it has actually created, I think, an unnecessary tension and just kind of sense of judgment within the orphan care community. But yes, there are very much, when you encounter people who are working, at least especially in the international context, right, when they're working with orphan and vulnerable children, you have people who are running orphanages, who are, putting on capital campaigns to build orphanages, who are sponsoring kids in orphanages. And have always done that. And that's what their church has done for a long time. And that's what they're sending their missionaries to do. And then on the other end, you have kind of this emerging movement. It's actually picked up a lot of momentum even in the last 3 to 4 years
Okay.
of organizations and faith-based, organizations, ministries, churches, movements moving toward deinstitutionalization, which is like the buzzword of getting kids out of orphanages and really, looking at a lot of the studies that all point to the detrimental effects of, kids growing up in institutions. And very much it's like you have those two groups, and unfortunately they a lot of times are at odds with one another. And I mean, I lived that, so I can tell you a little bit of that. Like I was caught in the middle of that. So my husband and I ran an orphanage for 5 years. We kind of like accidentally ended up running an orphanage. I recommend that to nobody. We were undertrained, we were underqualified, but honestly, this is the story of like most people I know in orphan care. It's like you're all heart, and then you're like, what are we doing? So we had 120 kids in our care, and this conversation kind of started happening with people in our circle about, hey, is this best for kids? And we had our own tension based off of our experiences of like, okay, like what is our end goal here, right? Like we were seeing just these really, I mean, heartbreaking like cycles playing out in real time, right in front of us. But at the same time, it's like you kind of trust the model because it's the model, right? It's like, I grew up in a church that always funded orphanages, that always sent, their high school short-term mission team to visit an orphanage. And I just kind of assumed, well, clearly if this is the best we've come up with, it's the best we can come up with, right? And so I experienced that kind of like push and pull for a while, where there's people around me being like, hey, we need to look at this research. Hey, have you read this? And it was so disorienting. I felt confused. I felt attacked. I felt like, okay, so you're saying that everything we've been pouring our lives into is actually just harmful to children? I mean, I couldn't wrap my head around that. And so I felt that kind of resistance of like, like, hey, we're different. I felt that for sure. And so I think that's accurate what you're saying. There's these two groups, and they're very much kind of like trying to prove to one another, what's the best way to go. And I would say that's very unfortunate. That it is.
Well, I guess the passion is understandable. I mean, you're both trying to help orphans. My gosh, like lives of these kids are at stake. So this isn't like, different approaches to like, biblical eschatology or something. I mean, not that that's not unimportant, but I mean, it's like, it's not taking care of orphans. So I would assume that different approaches that would see the other approach as possibly, I'm going to be cautious. I'll let you be bold. Possibly doing more harm than good, or doing unforeseen harm. If one approach is taking that, it has that perspective, I could see where somebody would be, very offended by that. So you started obviously on the orphanages, or used to use the phrase, institutionalized approach.
Institutional care, residential care, orphanage. We're all kind of talking about the same thing.
In layman terms,
growing up in a group home.
The orphanages are a good thing. They're great. And now you no longer hold that view. Can you walk us through some of the reasons why you now have a very different approach to orphan care?
Yeah, I sure can. I'll try to be succinct here as possible. So this was like not a pretty journey for me personally, nor for our organization. It was tough. I mean, there was just some years in there of turmoil. And anyway, so like I said, my husband and I, in our organization, we were running this orphanage. It's not something we really set out to do, but just kind of it happened. And we had these kids under our care, and man, those years were hard. They're really beautiful in a lot of ways. I mean, I could tell you crazy, just like Jesus stories that would blow your mind, right? But at the same time, like there's all this stuff happening under the surface, and I'll be really just transparent with you here. It's like abuse in orphanages is rampant. Nobody wants to talk about it. We have to talk about it. We were running what I believe to be a very good program, meaning we were well funded. We were training our staff, probably not to the extent we should have been, but we were vetting them. We had a lot of things going for us that honestly a lot of orphanages do not. And I mean, our organization and my husband and I, we were committed to like the taking care of the children in our care. We would hire nutritionists to make our menu, and all the kids had scholarships to a bilingual school. And on paper, it's like, wow, what a great opportunity, right? But I will tell you this, kids were not thriving under our care. And we had to wrestle with that. I mean, kids were, falling into self-destructive habits. We had kids being harmed under our care. So the reality is you put 120 kids who come from traumatic backgrounds together with a, caretaker ratio of 1 to 15, which is actually kind of low. Um, and you can't handle that. Like the model is just not set up. Like it is set up for survival. So I'm happy to report nobody ever died in our care, but like children would harm other children. Older kids would harm younger children. We had instances where there was instances with staff, and I say that with like it is hard to talk about. I mean, I carry those moments and situations like deep within me. I've had to reconcile them before the Lord to not walk in guilt and shame around that, because it was exhausting. It's like, no, like we're like, then what do we do? Where do we turn? Like where what do they need? What do the kids need? How do we stop this? And really, like, one of the most disheartening parts of that whole experience was like, we'd get a call from the courts for a case, and we would like recognize the last name, and it would be a family who like the mom had grown up in that orphanage, and now her child is coming back into the system. And so at some point we just had to be like, okay, like this isn't working. But to be fair, we didn't know what to do about that. It's like when you're in it and it's like, everyone's cheering you on. Honestly, that's the really confusing part that I'll just also be really honest about. It's like you have your churches and your people back home that are like, holding you up as the poster child of like how to be a great Christian and care for orphans. And then you're like, who do I tell about the abuse? Wow. Like, who do I tell about like how this is not working without like everybody freaking out and pulling funding? Because that would be detrimental too, right? It's like the transitions can't happen fast in this world. So it's like, man, it was so tough. And then I'll tell you a story. So there was definitely like a paradigm shift moment for us where it was like tension building, tension building, tension building. Then in 2017, so in Guatemala, there's private-run orphanages and there are state-run orphanages. The state-run orphanages are extremely overcrowded. Just it's a place. If you've ever walked into one, it is an experience. So there was a friend Guatemala City 17. I remember this day, any memory I have. I started getting calls on March 8th was the day. I started getting calls from like Child Protective Services asking if I'd heard what had happened. And so basically in one of these state-run facilities, there had been some protesting. So March 8th is International Women's Day. And some of the teenage girls were protesting abuse that they were experiencing in the home from caretakers, from staff. Some of the girls were being trafficked out to very prominent people in government. I mean, these reports are pretty well known across Guatemala, but nothing had ever been done. Actually, in the years leading up to this incident, 6 kids had died in care in that orphanage. Investigations had not been carried out. I mean, it was a ticking time bomb if you look at all the evidence, right? Yeah. But then on this particular day, some of the teenage girls were protesting, and they had planned to run away. And so some of them ran away. About 100 of them escaped. They called in the police, the National Guard, everybody you can think of. They ended up capturing most of these teenagers who had ran away. And as punishment, basically, for both the protesting and for running away, they were put into a like 6 by 7 meter room to sleep for the night. They were given a couple of mattresses, weren't allowed out to use the bathroom. They were under lock and key, and there was police officers guarding the door. At one point, early that morning, March 8th, some of the girls were mad that they couldn't use the bathroom. They were having to go to the bathroom on mattresses. So one of the girls lit a mattress on fire. Thinking surely they'll open the door. They did not open the door for 9 minutes, and the whole room was engulfed in flames. And so 56 girls were in that room. 41 of them died. They were burned alive in state custody. I'll just give you a moment to process. I mean, it is unthinkable, right? These are girls, these are kids who have experienced more trauma than most people will ever experience in their entire life. They are placed in that home because they need protection. The home was called Hogar Seguro, which means safe house. And that happened. I mean, so that moment for us, so we actually knew one of the girls who died that day. We had all of her siblings under our care at our orphanage. And I mean, I had to tell her 9-year-old sister how her sister had died. We buried her alongside her mom. So this is the shift for us. So this one girl, her name was Intl. She died that day on the spot, burned to death. And we were in communication with her mom, helping her identify the body. And all of a sudden, and this sounds so ridiculous looking back now, but I'm like, of course, her mom. Of course, her mom. Her mom lived 2 blocks from our orphanage and visited her kids every Sunday. But the reality is, we were so caught up in making sure the kids under our care had food and had a place to sleep and had their scholarships, and that we just weren't paying attention, right? Like, so I remember that day the day we buried Annalie, her mom was there, her siblings were there, my husband was there, a lot of the kids from our orphanage were there because they all knew this girl. And that was the shift. I just, personally, and then this, ended up translating into, our organization's work with just, made a promise to Annalie, like, this won't happen again. This can't happen again. Like, I will do everything in my power to get your siblings home, and as many kids home as possible. Because the reality is Annalie had a mom, right? And so today, fast forward 2022, all of her siblings are out of care. They're all home with their biological mom, and our team supports her mom. The reality is her mom was not a monster. Her mom was poor. And that is the case for most children in care. It's the leading factor driving kids away from family. And, it comes in as negligence. Annalie's case file would have said negligence, but the reality is not that her mom was purposely being negligent. Her mom did not have the means to care for her. She had her own trauma to work through, and there's other factors there. But the at the end of the day, the cause was that she was poor. She was a single mom supporting a lot of kids. Her kids were home alone. There were just things that were happening because of their financial situation that ultimately did put the kids at risk. But they were not orphans, right? Annalie was not an orphan. Her siblings were orphans. And so that's, if I had to pinpoint it for us, and there's a lot of other factors, honestly, I can accredit some of the shift here too, to other people coming around me and saying, okay, mentors and people who came and just introduced us to research and people. But if I had to boil it down, it's that moment of she wasn't an orphan and she died in care.
And that's statistically, is this a fact that most kids in orphanages do have at least one parent still alive, that it's largely out of poverty why they end up in an orphanage? Is that?
Yeah, it's 80 to 90%. So in Guatemala, where it's closer to like 90-95%. It's actually really shocking. Yeah. And so that's actually why, I use the term orphanage just because it's the term that people most understand, but even the term itself is problematic because we're painting a picture that an orphanage houses orphans, right? They do not. Right? Like the instances where a child is a double orphan. So like in the orphan care community, we refer to like single orphans who have lost one parent and double orphans. The number of kids who are double orphans is very, very much the exception. So yeah, 80, but globally, the statistic is about 80 to 90% of kids in residential care or in orphanages have a living parent.
And the definition of orphan, I would assume, is the death of both parents, not just single parent household. We have tons of that here in
yeah, technically, if you like look up the term as it's defined by like some of these like UNICEF and different people, say an orphan is anybody who has lost one parent, actually. So then you get into the specifics of a single orphan versus a double orphan. But yes, for the most part, people hear the word orphan, they're assuming a double orphan, meaning that the child's parents are deceased, right?
So,
So
So you're saying one of the main issues for you is that there's a lot of abuse that happens both between, I'll just use the phrase, among the orphans, and often with staff and caretakers and everything. Like, and this is a very widespread problem in orphanages across the globe. You probably can't maybe speak to all of that, but is that something that people that aren't in this work are kind of blissfully unaware of, that there's a lot of abuse that's happening?
Yeah, that's why I mention it. Honestly, it's the tip of the iceberg if we're talking about the risks of institutional care, but I always kind of lead with it because I think it's the most shocking to people. I don't know, because people know people who run orphanages, and they're just like, they want to believe that the orphanages they support or the orphanages they visited are the exception.
Right.
And I understand that. You want to think that, if you visited an orphanage, it probably felt a lot like summer camp, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you did a piñata with the kids and had a pizza party and painted their faces, and you were just so grateful that this ministry was there to care for those kids. And I hate that I sound sarcastic. I don't mean to sound sarcastic, but it is, it's 7 days and you're not there at night. Like you're not there in these moments where like children would normally have the parental supervision. So I would say it is definitely the tip of the iceberg. That's probably the most like the ugliest part, but then you get down into just like the actual nature of growing up in institutional care. So like even if a child, spends years in an orphanage and is never abused, their life is going to be dramatically altered by the simple fact that they were raised not in a family context. And that's where you can get really deep into some of the studies, and it's relatively new. Like Bowlby is the like guy who kind of studied attachment theory. But that didn't come out to like the 60s and 70s. So in some senses, it makes sense that we're kind of just now being like, okay, maybe this model is not ideal. But when you start looking at just the nature of like, the need for a child to attach to a primary caretaker, and I'm not talking about a paid staff member at an orphanage. That's not a primary caretaker. That's a staff member, right? And when that doesn't happen for a child, what happens just like developmentally for them? So like you can look at studies that will show that, so like for every 3 months that a child is in an orphanage, they actually regress a month developmentally. And so you start doing the math, and it's like, okay, if a kid grows up in an orphanage and ages out at 18, he actually is developmentally programmed like a 12-year-old. And then you wonder why they have these outcomes of not being able to hold jobs and becoming homeless. Their brain is actually like not able to make the connection. Like God designed us for family. This is what it comes down to. Like that design was intentional, right? Like we are birthed into the world by a mother and a father. And our brains are like so beautifully designed to thrive in that environment. And especially when we're looking at kids ages 0 to 3, if a kid is placed in institutional care in that crucial period, I mean, the long-term effects are devastating. I mean, those kids will be shorter, physically shorter. I mean, there's a direct correlation. It doesn't even like make sense, but it does. I mean, I could get like really meta here with studies, and I won't. Like those kids will statistically be shorter, have a smaller head circumference, have a lower IQ. Like it affects your entire being, right? When your needs are not being met in a consistent way by a loving primary caretaker. There's a study done in Russia in like the early 2000s studying the outcomes of kids who grow up in institutional care. And what they were determined from this study is that with this group that they did the study with, 1 in 3 became homeless. 1 in 5 had a criminal record. 1 in 7 was involved in prostitution, and 1 in 10 had committed suicide. So that 1 in 10 statistic means that a child growing up in institutional care is 500 times more likely to take their own life than a child growing up in a family context. Like that statistic rocks me. I'm like it just points to, right, like the role a family plays in identity and belonging, in your just sense of self-value, right? We have 1 in 10 kids aging out of residential care and taking their own life because they've been unable to find their place in the world in the context of, the walls of an orphanage.
So I got 2 somewhat complicated questions. I mean, the question itself is simple, but it might take a while to unpack. I'll just throw them both out because I guess they're a little bit related. Number one, like the abuse that's happening. Is this intrinsic to the system, or is it just the system's good? There's just needs to be a cleanup on aisle 4, by way of analogy, there's abuse that happens in the church. Does that mean church is bad, or that we need to clean house a bit more? Abuse can happen in a public school. Does that mean public schools are intrinsically fostering this? or do we just need to improve the system itself? So that's my first question is, do we know that the abuse that's happening, is that intrinsic to the nature of orphanages? That's my first question. The second question is, what about with all the stuff you just said recently? What if they're home? What if they do have, what if they have two parents alive? What if their mom's a crack addict and their father is an alcoholic and abusive? And so their home environment would involve physical and sexual abuse, maybe being trafficked out by their parents. Wouldn't an institutionalized context, all things considered, be better than that? Because just being in a family is one thing if the family's halfway decent, but there's some really awful family environments out there too. So
Yeah.
how would you, I'm sure you've wrestled with both of those questions, but
Yeah, great questions. I really appreciate that. So in terms of, is the system itself broken, or is this just, something that needs to be focused on? We can put policies in place, whatever. No, I would say the system is broken. So this is different. We live in a fallen world. So yes, abuse is happening everywhere. And children are especially vulnerable in the church, in school. They are going to be preyed upon because they are vulnerable, right? But in this instance, the model actually just lends itself to it more so than just generic human brokenness.
You said it earlier, and I didn't want to answer my question for you, but you said it earlier. You're putting, by definition, people who have been through significant trauma all together.
You're putting them together with undertrained staff, underpaid staff, tired staff, and they're just not receiving the individualized attention they need to go through the healing process. It is setting them up for failure at every turn. It truly is. And the issue here is if I thought, well, it's unavoidable, we have to send them to institutions, then yes, let's put systems in place. Let's figure out how to vet staff. Let's decrease our child to staff rate, caretaker ratio. Let's do things so the abuse is less prevalent. And that's kind of what I thought when I was early on in this journey. I'm like, okay, so we put better systems in place. But when I realized, we can actually do away with the model entirely for the most part, then I'm like, let's just move in that direction. This just seems too risky. So it kind of leads into your second question. So then what, right? Obviously, because we live in a broken world, this is not going away, right? Children are often, growing up, being, birthed into unsafe home environments. So what happens? And so the best way I know how to explain it is just you follow the logical, when you're looking to solve a problem, right? So the issue, for your example, the child growing up in a home where there's substance abuse, and maybe some other things going on. It's okay, so the family they've been birthed into is not safe for them right now, and I think that right now is a really important word we can come back to. So they need to be removed, right? But it just doesn't make sense to take the thing that was broken and then replace it with this other thing that doesn't even resemble an institution, right? I guess what I'm getting at, when a child needs to be removed from their family environment, we have to replace it with family. It's not perfect. So what I'm getting at is traditional foster care. And this is a whole other can of worms, because in the States, we actually have a really kind of, I don't know, people have different opinions about foster care, and we kind of hear these horror stories, and you hear people who've never even engaged with the foster care system just being yeah, it's broken. I'm boil that down. What are we talking about here, right? What is broken? And what I'll say there is, yes, it's broken because it's something put in place to remedy the fact that there's a broken family. The main broken thing is not the system. The main broken thing was the broken family. That should have never happened. That's heartbreaking, but it happens in our world, right? So what I would say is, for 98, 99% of children, the best course for them is, so they're living in that environment. Hopefully somebody picks up on it, somebody reports it, right? A teacher, a neighbor, somebody. If that child does have to be removed from care, and we need to really, in the situation you gave, the child needs to be removed from care. I will say that children are oftentimes unnecessarily removed from care. A report will get made, hey, these kids are being left at home for extended periods of time. And that's concerning if it's a young child. But we got to do some digging. Where is mom? Is she at work? Okay. Is she, when she is home, is she loving and caring? Okay. Is there a daycare, right? Anything we can do to prevent that trauma of separation. I mean, separating a child from their family is that's irreversible. The trauma
Mm-hmm.
that happens in that moment for the child and the parent is like, man, it's going to take years, decades to
Mm-hmm.
repair that, right? So like if it can be avoided, we need to avoid it. And I would say there's a huge gap in service there from organizations, from churches that are just like, oh, well, the situation seems sketchy, remove the child.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to your point, so when a child does need removed from care, foster care is the best thing that we've come up with because it is still family. So it is
Mm-hmm.
not their biological family, but the structure, God's intended structure of like family
Mm-hmm.
is there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And just the essence of, even in foster care is just different
Mm-hmm.
than the like you walk into an orphanage and there's 20-foot high walls on all sides of it. Like in no way does it resemble
Mm-hmm.
life. It is very much like a glorified children's prison. I will tell you that. I lived in the orphanage. I ran the orphan like that is what it feels like. And I wasn't a child living there. I mean, I was an adult who'd been raised in a family, and I would sometimes look around and be like, why do I live behind barbed wire? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it is unnatural. It is not conducive to a child like actually beginning to work through the pain of everything that just happened. They just had the
Mm-hmm.
worst thing imaginable that can happen to a child happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you walk into like, all right, now you eat lunch in a cafeteria. It's like anything that looked like your home life, however
Mm-hmm.
messed up your home life was, is just gone. Like this is not family life. Like you are in an institution. So I would say to that, for those kids, foster care.
Okay.
And that sounds like, oh yeah, of course, but in most of the developing world, this is like a brand new concept. Foster care is not happening. It's not, in a lot of countries, it's not legal. Organizations are not, they're not doing this. This isn't one of their programs, seeking out local foster families, from within the local church to
Yeah.
stand in the gap for those kids that do have to be removed from care.
So you almost answered it for me. Is I don't know what verb to use here. Is the existence of orphanages keeping better systems from being developed? Like as long as there's tons of orphanages around, there's no sort of need to explore better options,
Yeah.
foster care. Because like is that an accurate state? Is that a big beef within like you're kind of by keeping these things going? While it seems like it is a band-aid that might it's not ideal, but it's with something and there's no other options available, but it's like as long as these things are existing, nobody's going to explore other options. Is that accurate to say?
Dude, I think you're hitting it on, what's the phrase? You're hitting it
Oh,
the nail. Yeah, you're hitting the
nail
nail
on the
on
head.
the head. That's the thing. Yeah, and this is such a tough part of this conversation. I try and really be careful with my words because it can sound so accusatory, but like the more we fund orphanages, the more we focus on them, the more we pour resources into them, like we are keeping kids from their feelings. It's like build it and they will come.
Huh.
As long as there are orphanages, we will fill them. And it's an industry.
Can you expand on
It's
that?
absolutely an
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure I
Yeah,
can. So
it's an industry.
I so um from North America, we send about 2 million people on short-term mission trips a year. This is just North America. We're not talking about Europe and everywhere else. We send about 2 million people on short-term mission trips. We're looking at between like 2 and 6 and like $8 billion that we're putting into short-term missions. Most of those people are visiting and working in orphanages. I mean, it is a common part of a typical mission trip. So like we have short-term missions, we have child sponsorship programs. There's a lot of money coming into orphanages. I am not saying the vast majority of people running orphanages and ministries involved in orphan care are not looking to make profit. There are those people. I've
Yeah.
met them. I've
Really?
met very
I mean,
lucrative orphanages.
okay.
Yeah. So there's we could have a whole other conversation here about the nature of like orphanage trafficking, which is, I mean, people are like luring kids into orphanages because it is, I can tell you from experience, it is easy to secure a donation by plastering a kid's face on the internet. We don't run child sponsorship anymore, and our funding is like, it's terrible. And we won't run child sponsorship because we don't believe it to be best practice. But when we did, we didn't ever struggle with funding. There is just something that draws people in. And so then this is the exception. I want to emphasize that. But you do have orphanages that are that corrupt, where people are making good money off of convincing parents to give their kids up, telling them they'll have a better life, kidnapping, falsifying paperwork, falsifying death certificates. I'm telling you, it is ugly, ugly, ugly. I don't want to focus on that. That is the exception.
That's the exception.
So more when I say this is an industry, it's like an not intentional industry, but like it just happens quickly. Like let's say you build an orphanage, and then all of a sudden you have like all these mission teams visiting you. You have all these child sponsors, and it's like, I will tell you this from personal experience, and this takes all the humility inside of me to say this. Like, there is a pressure you feel to your donor community to like, I don't know, it's like almost like you can like prove you're doing good work by having more kids. And that's like really gross to say. This was so buried in me. This took me like 4 years to be like, oh my gosh. And I like couldn't look myself in the mirror. Not that like we were, you understand what I'm saying? Not, like our organization has never like tried to like make money, but there is this thing where it's like, okay, I'll give you an example. So like if a kid was going to be potentially reunified with their family, which we were not heavy on reunification. This would be like Child Protective Services moving this forward. Now we have a whole reunification program, and it's awesome. There would be a tension, and I wouldn't have been able to name it in the moment. I can only name it now that I'm on the other side. There would have been a tension of like, what do I tell their sponsor? That is so messed up. Like, a child is going home. Like, this is the goal. And obviously that never like influenced our work, but I will tell you that there would be that brief moment of like, I've had sponsors like get upset with me when their child leaves. Like, it is a weird world where the people funding, where the people funding these models feel like an ownership of the child. And it is disturbing. So like, we used to run a short-term mission program. And then at one point I was like, okay, like we have to get this under control. Like, we have vulnerable children in our care. We can't have people taking photos. We can't have people going in their bedrooms. Like, and so like pretty, quickly after we started hosting our first teams, we put some pretty rigid expectations into place, just in terms of like, what volunteers could and could not do. Volunteers were not allowed to hug children. If they did and a child wanted a hug, they had to ask for it. It couldn't, it was pretty specific. And teams could not follow the rules. It was so disturbing. Like, they're like, basically, then why are we here, sort of? And I'm like, no, you don't. You hear what we're saying though? Like, we're telling you that, like, I know that feels great for you. It is actually harmful to that child's worldview. It is harmful to them being able to form a healthy attachment as adults. Like, don't do it. And they would be like, this is like grown adults would be like, wait till like nobody was watching and like take a selfie. Like, it is like, I had a team one time write me a letter about how, since we had implemented these limitations, like, the children were suffering. And part of their letter said, it's just so disturbing because now when we visit and when we leave, the kids don't cry.
Oh my God.
I'm like, thank God. That sounds like that's an unnecessary trauma. I'm so happy to hear that you've observed that, right? And they were like, no. It means like they're like being emotionally like almost like abused. Like, you're telling them they can't connect with people. And I'm like, no, we're just telling them that like they don't have to connect with strangers. That's not a fair expectation, right? Like, so I don't remember where I was going with this. So there's just this industry, and we have to talk about it, because it's like, it's not, and I'm saying this is not an accusation. Like, I'm saying we did this. We had the best of intentions. My heart and Story's heart, my organization, my husband, everybody who's worked with us from the get-go, it's like, we want to serve vulnerable children. I can tell you, like, there has never been any other desire or intention in our heart. But if you are not careful, this is a weird world. And then all of a sudden you're just caught up, and you have these teams, and you have these donors, and you have these child sponsors. And it's like, yes, the more money, to answer your question, the more money and resources we pour into orphanages, we are taking away from these other alternatives. And I mean, So we just had this experience. We have started a foster care program in our region, the first of its kind. We partnered with the government. My organization is now like a private foster care agency, basically, where we recruit and train families from the local church. It's a great model. And we had like all these families that were approved. Like, not all these families, a couple of families that were approved as foster families. They'd gone through extensive training. I'm like, this is the best alternative. If a child truly has to be removed from their family in our city, these are the people they need to be with, right? And the judge in our town, who is, responsible for placing children, would, for many months, wouldn't put a kid in our care. And his point was kind of like, there's an orphanage down the road, and we know that model works.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so to your point, yeah, as long as there is an orphanage and people are familiar with that model, that was kind of his perspective. Like, well, yeah, but I'm not comfortable with this, basically. I don't know these families. You trained them, you accredited it, like, but there's the orphanage. And so we've worked through that, and now we're his first line of, defense for kids coming into care. But yes.
Going back to the financial part, I could imagine, especially American churches and just Americans in general, we like numbers, we like growth, we like to see things double and triple and grow. And I could imagine that they wouldn't realize that if you sent a newsletter out saying, hey, I just want to celebrate something with you, we've gone from 200 orphans to 50, that would people kind of see that as a failure just because they're so geared towards numerical growth that they don't realize that growing the number of orphans might not be a measure of success? Did you run into that when you were running it, or?
The nonprofit world is so weird. So it's like everyone wants you to measure your success. And like, I've kind of come to this realization. I'm like, it's really weird the way most nonprofits measure their success. Like, really, if you were doing your job, for most nonprofits, the issue you're looking to solve, success looks like serving less and less people each year. Like in a lot of ways, like we have to get more creative with our reporting, because it's like, yes, like if you're just looking for numbers, like of people served, it's so superficial, right? It's like, like 300 kids in an orphanage, that's a disaster. But like, if you're not looking deeply, it might look like, oh, well, you're impacting so many lives, right? And something we've struggled with. We have a family preservation program. It's all about prevention. So it's those families that I mentioned who their kids don't need to come into care. They don't need to be separated, but they are at risk. So like the kids are maybe not getting the appropriate, care they need, but it's because of XYZ, like some kind of preventable, an issue we can work on before going to separation. And I have the hardest time explaining that program to people, because they're like, how many families? And I'm like, man, there's some families we've been working with for 5 years. And it's like, it's slow going. I mean, when you're digging into like intergenerational trauma and like coping mechanisms and like things that ultimately contribute to a dysfunctional environment where a child might be at risk, it's like, you got to put in work. And so it's like, yeah, we're working with 20 families, and yes, we've been working with them for 5 years. And yes, I believe that this is more impactful than housing 600 kids in an orphanage, right? It's like, you're shifting like generational trajectories. The other interesting financial piece there is like supporting kids in traditional foster care is significantly less expensive than supporting kids in institutional care.
Really?
So like, it's something I really try to emphasize with churches. So it's 3 times more expensive to house a single child in an institutional care setting than it is to place them with the foster family. Because the reality is you have to have all this staff, and like something like 30 to 50% of those staff members aren't caretakers. They're not interacting with the kids. You have to run, and if you have more than 30 kids, you have to run the facility like a facility. You have a maintenance person, you have a secretary, you have a cook, you have a cleaning person. It's like all of a sudden it just gets really expensive. And versus placing a child with a foster family, it's 3 times less expensive. Wow. Meaning that like churches and people looking to support, orphan and vulnerable children with their finances can do a lot more good by supporting an organization that is, in family-based care.
So if the president of Guatemala called you up and said, all right, Alycia, you got 10 years, you have unilateral control over this entire system, how would it be like a gradual fading out of orphanages while the foster care system is put in place? Because again, even if on paper if it's broken and the existence of orphanages are perpetuating the brokenness, if you just ended that overnight with nothing in place, that wouldn't be good either, right? Like ending orphanages alone would be a disaster too if there's nothing put in place. So you got 10 years. I kind of rewrote the script. I just literally put words in your mouth, but what would you do in those 10 years? Would that be something like that?
Yep, exactly. The transition has to be slow, and it's not something our particular organization did well. And it's something when I get the chance to talk to other organizations, I'm like, yes, be strategic, be slow, bring your donors into the fold, educate them. Like they are in this, they're just as invested as you. Like do this together. And yes, it cannot happen overnight. There's around 8 million kids around the globe living in orphanages, and it's like, every country is different. Every context is different. And you have to figure out how to work within the cultural context, also within the structure of just national laws and different things. So yes, it has to happen slow. So like in Guatemala, if in your scenario, you just look at the kids in care, right? This is the first step, right? All the people running orphanages, like just start like figuring out where their families are. We know that 80 to 90% of them have families, right? And it requires a lot of professionals, a lot of practitioners, social workers, psychologists.
And the majority of those families are not the kind of abusive situation that I described. You're saying that the main cause is simply poverty. I mean, it might not be ideal, might not be, but like it's not like a super toxic environment. It's just a poor family.
Some of them will. Some of them will be. So the 80 to 90%, I'm talking about all kids who have families. So a good majority, I'm going to say about 50% of that 80 to 90%, it's going to be poverty. And it's going to be, how do we get your mom a steady job? How do we get your dad a steady job? How do we find a daycare facility so you're not left, home alone? How do we get you into a more stable housing environment? The other 50% is going to be a little more complicated. You're going to be looking at people who struggle with substance abuse, people who are abusive, deal with anger issues, whatever it is. But those aren't lost causes either. And this is like, organizations just have to be willing to put in the work. It's like parents love their children. I'm telling you, I have sat face to face with parents who have done things that you would say in your heart, I would never. Mm-hmm. And then you get to know them. And then you hear their story, and you hear how they were raised, and you hear how the trauma and the abuse goes back 6 generations, and how they didn't actually know that hitting their kids was bad, like beating them. I mean, it just comes down to education. Like, we do parenting classes. You'd be amazed at the light bulbs that go off in these parenting classes where they're like, wait, I don't have to beat my kid.
Wow.
Like it's like, so I would, even those cases where you're like, man, this one's complicated. Yes, it is complicated, but I would say even the majority of those kids. And so here's the other thing too. If kids can't go back with their biological parents, that's a very real scenario. There is other family. So for like most of human existence, this is how it worked when we lived in closer knit communities, right? It's like, if there's an issue with the family, you go live with your aunt, or you go live with your grandma, or you go live with your second cousin. And so it's called kinship care, right? Like in orphan care. So like, then you start looking at kinship care. Like the reality is like, you start doing all of that and then you're like, okay, if not kinship care, foster care. And then let's move to adoption. Like the reality is that there is just nowhere in we call it like the continuum of care. I would say with like there's a very small but, and that's for like kids with severe disabilities or like mental health issues who would potentially benefit from like a clinical environment. Mm-hmm. But let's just like put that over to the side. That's a whole other conversation. The majority of kids in care, they could either be reunified, biological family, with like mom and dad, go to extended family. If not that, be placed in foster care. And then if even after a time in foster care, it doesn't look like they could ever go home, then that case moves to adoption. And again, this is a complex thing, because then you can ask the question, well, what about, the 16-year-old who is never going to get adopted? And then we got to talk about aging out of care. But for the purposes of our conversation today, like for most kids, there is a family option where institutional care can be avoided. But yes, the transition has to be slow and it has to be intentional, and you have to make sure kids aren't falling through the cracks in the meantime.
So what about the countries you mentioned earlier where foster care is illegal, or like the possibility of an alternative system being put in place is really meager to like impossible? Would you say that in those cases, orphanages are the only option? I'm thinking of somebody listening who was like, oh my gosh, I'm giving money to an orphanage and I'm I'm going to
Yeah.
rethink that. But then if they look in and say, oh, in this country, there's nothing else and no one else is doing anything different. So like, is that the lesser of
Yeah.
the evils? I mean, would you say, or,
I mean, maybe for right now, but I don't think it's okay to continue with that. So there are so many like organizations or like that are, this is what they do is they help other organizations work with their local governments.
okay.
Like there's so many resources out there where like if somebody was in a country where they're like, hey, foster care doesn't exist here, but like what would it look like to start it? Like reach out to us to any we would just probably just connect you with somebody else who has more of like a global reach, but there are these organizations who are doing that, like helping organizations transition their services. And it is a transition. It's not switching one thing out for another. I think
Yeah.
it's an important thing to think about. It's like, yes, you have this facility. Awesome. What could this facility be one day? Could it be a daycare facility? Could it be a rehab facility? Could it be a space where you host parenting classes and family nights out? And how can you like support these kids once they're home? How can you repurpose your funding, repurpose your facilities, repurpose your staff, right? Like this doesn't have to be like, all right, like throw this all in the trash. We got to rebuild a new organization. It's like, what are you doing today? And what does it look like to move closer to supporting kids and family tomorrow, right? And maybe it's one kid. Maybe you figure out how to get that one kid home, and then you go to the next kid, and then you figure out how to go to systems and policies and the rest of it. But I would just say to people to be very wary of organizations who are not on that trajectory at all. And not wary like they're doing harm, but I would say, okay, we need to have a conversation, right? And yeah.
Is there financial motivations for the government to like, do orphanages bring in a lot of kind of Western income into the country? Like a more corrupt leader of certain countries, could they say, oh, we ain't getting rid of these orphanages? Did these bring in resources? Is that a
yes,
thing?
and I hate talking about it. It's like it makes you feel so just like heavy and burdened for the world. But yes, I mean orphanages. If you look at a map, they are placed strategically in tourist hotspots, and they will be. I was reading a study, and
Wait,
I'm
in
gonna
what spots?
like
I missed it. What did
right
you say? They're placed where?
and tourist hotspots. So I was reading a study. I think it was on like Cambodia yesterday, where like something like the number of orphans has like decreased by like 50% in the country in the last 10 years, but the number of orphanages has increased by 75%. I'm like butchering the numbers, but it was something shocking like that. And all of those orphanages are placed in tourist hotspots. So yes, so like I said, we're looking at, billions of dollars just from short-term missions alone coming in to countries because people are going to visit the orphanages. So, oh man, it's complex. But yes, there are like all these kind of incentives actually to keep kids in institutional care, and the stakes are just too high though. Like we're setting kids up for failure. And I mean, I told you the story of the fire. In some cases, we're setting kids up for death, for not just abuse or like poor outcomes, but like their life is actually at stake. Yeah.
How do you so let's maybe go all the way back now. What your organization now? Give us the elevator pitch. Like, what do you do? I mean, you've kind of given us bits and pieces and stuff. So, what is it that you now do now that you don't have an orphanage that you're running?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a dual approach. So we do prevention on the front end. So we have a family preservation program, which just means we have a whole team of psychologists and social workers who are dedicated to identifying vulnerable families in our community. Okay. So a lot of times those connections come through the church. We'll have somebody from the local church be like, hey, there's a family in our congregation. They're struggling. Sometimes it'll be through CPS, like Child Protective Services, who will say, hey, we've had some calls about this family. Do you want to check in on them? It's totally voluntary on the family's part, but basically we come alongside them and say, hey, we know you don't want to be separated. We don't want you to be separated. What do you need? And, our social workers do, an in-depth study of their home and their family dynamics and their finances. And then we just provide services, scholarships, a free lunch program, a discipleship program, individual counseling, family counseling, etc. It is the most exciting part of our work. It's the hardest part to pitch to people because it's like, they're like, well, that looks like dependency. And I'm like, yeah, it does for a little bit. And that's kind of what families need. They need somebody they can depend on, because actually a lot of times, like those moms and those dads, they have no family support system. Like that's the reason they're in the situation they're in, is their own family history is so broken. Like they can't call their mom to come babysit. Like,
Yeah.
the families we support, they call our social workers and they'll just be like, hey, how much ibuprofen do I give to my 2-year-old? And those calls never cease to like amaze me, because I'm like, this is the only person you had in your phone to call to ask that question. And it really is amazing, just like, but what happens when people, like, just the accountability of knowing somebody's there, like, it's amazing the healing that's happening in some of those families, because they're just like, hey, at least I know 2 people in the world care
Mhm.
about how my family is doing, right?
Mhm.
So that's on the front end, family preservation. And then on the back end, so obviously that's not the case for all children. Like you said, there are scenarios where kids are unsafe at home. And so we run a foster care program. So we are a private foster care agency partnering with the Guatemalan government. And I mean, it's really exciting because it really is like, and we could, talk about this even, just like the church's role in all of
Mhm.
this, in orphan care in general. We're really able to empower the local church, and it is really, really beautiful to
Wow.
watch them be like, these are our kids, like the kids in our community, like this is biblical. Like we are supposed to
Mhm.
stand in the gap, right? Like they're, and so we partner with local churches, recruit families, train them, license them, place kids in
Mhm.
their care, and then we immediately start working towards reunification if it's possible. So even once a child's in foster care, that's not a long-term solution,
Right.
right? So our team tries to determine, okay, could this child go home eventually? And if not, we need to move towards adoption quickly, because
Mhm.
the longer they're in care, the less likely it is that they would be adopted.
How do you deal with and I'm we're coming up on an hour, so I'll have to
Yeah.
save my questions for a later time, but how do you deal with aftercare? This is something I've more recently been more
Mm-hmm.
in, I guess, in tune with, that when somebody has been through childhood trauma, like, and almost the word trauma has been watered down today. Like my teacher yelled at me and I'm traumatized, but
Yeah.
people who have been
Yeah.
like, I mean, sexually abused, physically abused, especially sexual abuse, like at a young age,
Mm-hmm.
recovering from that is obviously not impossible, but man, the aftercare is, it takes a lot of just psychological unraveling. And yeah, and I've seen some, organizations that I don't know if they realize maybe the hard, ongoing, intense work that it takes to get somebody to where actually they're actually going to live a flourishing life. Which I guess, first of all, would you
Mm-hmm.
agree with that the recovering from childhood trauma is a massive under maybe touched area? And secondly, how do you go about that?
Huge gap in service, like at the aging out process, and just, yeah, the aftercare, like you say. I mean, we just need a lot more hands on deck,
Yeah.
just like globally. Organizations offering counseling services. But here's what. So the encouraging thing about all of this, because it can be just a real downer of a
Yeah.
conversation,
I
right? It's
bet.
like, you know, kids shouldn't suffer. Why are they suffering? And why are the systems in place to help them not working? But it really is amazing how God's designed our brain. So like even just this is like recent in like we've been able to study this from a scientific lens, like just the nature of, it's called neuroplasticity, like
Yeah.
the ability of our brain to actually form new pathways based off of our experience, right?
Hmm.
It's like the brain says, okay, if enough bad things happen, it forms certain neural pathways. If enough good things happen to contradict that trauma, it actually just starts rebuilding itself. It's really amazing, right?
Hmm.
And so I would say there's two things. That there's the real, like, just like people need professional services. They need counseling. Like kids need to be, if they've been, spent any time in the child protective system, like, or just experienced, family trauma in general. It's like, yes, they need professional support, but also they just need experiences that contradict their trauma. So
Mm.
if trauma happens in the context of a relationship, the best way to contradict it is in the or to heal is actually in this through the same vehicle of relationship, which is why, like, man, when I talk to Christians who are like wanting to get involved, I'm like, find one kid in your community. It doesn't have to be foster care. I don't think everybody's called to foster. I don't think everybody is called to adopt, but I'm like, but you should probably think long and hard about getting a little closer.
Hmm.
to this issue, because healing happens, and the healing is so important because it's for that individual, but it's also generational. I'm telling you, like, you can look back, like, no, it is so rare for a kid to come into care and you to look back at their family history and be like, weird, this came out of nowhere. I mean, this is like, this will continue to repeat itself as long as people are not experiencing true healing at a brain level, at a heart level, at a spiritual Jesus level, like from their trauma. But like that's going to happen in the context of relationship. I would say, like, when I think about especially, teenagers and people who have just floated through the system their whole life and have experienced abuse and sexual abuse and separation after separation. Maybe they've been in an orphanage or maybe in foster care, which, is better than an orphanage, but it's still foster care. Uh, it's like, yeah, they just need people. They need mentors. They need people who will call them twice a week and who will like invite them into their lives and like help their brains understand, right? That they're like, you can have a new experience, right? You can exist in relationship with people and they're not always going to harm you. That's what I've seen me be most effective, is just like having experiences that contradict their trauma. And so, I have a lot of like friends who are like kind of intimidated to like get involved in this. Like, so my husband and I, we just, we did this for 8.5, 9 years, 10 years in Guatemala. We just moved back to the States and we just wrapped up our licensing process to be a foster family. And so I still run the organization, but we're also going to foster in our home, and we're going to foster teenagers, right? And people get so intimidated. Like I had a conversation with a friend the other day. It was like, she's like, I just have to confess, I don't like know how to talk to you about this because like my husband and I aren't going to foster. Like that's not what we're going to do. But like, I feel like I need to do something. And I'm like, oh my gosh, yes. Like, it doesn't have to look like one way. Like loving people well in brokenness, like looks like a lot of different ways. I'm like, okay, so when this kid comes into our home, will you take them out to coffee twice a month and be a mentor? And she's like, well, yeah, what do you mean? That's easy. I'm like, perfect. like that's it. Those are the like relationships and like the vehicle for those kids to actually start to heal alongside professional people coming alongside them.
2 more quick questions. People who have been maybe disoriented listening to this whole conversation are like, wow, well, I want to dig deeper. Can you recommend some resources, maybe books, articles, whatever, for people to say, I want to look into this a little more?
Yeah, there's so much out there. So let me think of the best. So I would say start with an organization called Faith to Action. They have been influential in our journey. Some of our team went through trainings with them. They are dedicated to basically just advocating for why family-based care is important, especially why the church should be advocating for family-based care. And they have some great resources on their website. So Faith to Action. Lumos is J.K. Rowling's foundation, and they do great work in the UK, I mean, around the globe, advocating. Their language is harsh. So if anyone's been listening to this and is like, yikes, that was like harsh, maybe don't go straight to Lumos. They are, very direct in saying never visit an orphanage, never fund an orphanage, but they back everything with research, and it is, their work is well done. So I would say Faith to Action, start there, and maybe head over to Lumos.
Are there any books? Like, what's the main book that's like, kind of like I mentioned offline, When Helping Hurts, kind of reshaped how people think about even poverty relief? Is there a book that's like, oh, this is kind of the page turner that would really disorient people's perspective?
No, maybe I'm ignorant. So hopefully if I'm wrong, somebody correct me. I cannot think. I have not read a book, and I scour the world for resources on this stuff. So there are a lot of great like scholarly resources out there, like 30-page articles you can find online.
Yeah.
I can't think of a book. Somebody needs to write that book.
Maybe you need to write it, Alycia.
Yeah, well, one day my children grow up.
Last question. Anybody's listening that's really jazzed about what you're doing, want to support you, what are your needs? And don't be shy. Like, people are wanting to get alongside what people are doing. So do you have like major endless financial needs? Do you have personnel needs? How can people help what you're doing?
Yeah, pretty much endless financial needs, just being totally honest. We've had a hard time raising funds for our new model. We've struggled ever since we've shifted. People like child sponsorship, and we don't offer any sort of that like one-on-one connection with the people we serve. We just don't think it necessarily is promotes the dignity of the individuals that we serve. So, yeah, we're a streamlined organization. We don't have like a big development team out there doing fundraising. So yeah, if specifically what Story is doing is interesting to you, fundraising is funds, financial resources are our greatest need. But
real quick, what's your website? I'll put it in the show notes, but what's the website?
Yeah, storyintl.org.
Say it again. Story what?
INTL, so Story International, but just like the
.org. Okay, storyintl.org. I'm sure it's easy to find where the people can give on there.
Yes, it is.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Alycia. My head's spinning. I mean, we talked offline, and I've already been kind of thinking in this direction. And just it started years ago when I started to rethink kind of short-term missions and the purpose of that, and just missions in general. I feel like there is kind of a residue of colonialism, kind of white savior mentality that we need to reflect on. And I appreciate you said several times you don't want to be harsh. You don't want to make people feel bad or whatever. I guess you do bring a lot of credibility in that you actually have done that approach and are still doing the work in a different way. So you're speaking from deep experience, which if I just sat here and says, oh, we should do this, should do that, people should take that with a grain of salt, but you have the experience and heart behind what you're doing. So I appreciate your humility and caution, but also, yeah, speak the truth, and I think you did that well. So thank you so much for your time. And I hope,
it's been great. I know this can be a tough conversation, but it's encouraging to me that this is even like people want to talk about this. You want to talk about this. I'm like so convinced that like the church is the solution. I'm like, we just gotta tweak the model. We gotta shift some things. Like the heart is there. People are well intentioned, and I continue to believe that. So thanks for this conversation. Thanks for asking great questions.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, have a good day.